Hello, welcome. My name is Tita Chico. I'm professor of English and faculty director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. Today, I'm very delighted to welcome you in my capacity as faculty director to our partnership with colleagues and friends at the Phillips Collection. We're partnering today to present a program called Haunted, the Black Body as Ancestor and Spectre. It's an episode in our 2021-2022 series, Anti-Racism, Communities and Collaborations. Following the lead of the Mellon Foundation's new emphasis on building just communities, this series features scholarship, teaching, and public engagement to reimagine boundaries, model anti-racist principles, and foster collaborative relations across and beyond campus. We commit in this series to art as a liberatory mode and as a crucible of reckoning. We commit also to the importance of community and communal histories, decentering whiteness, dismantling white supremacy, refusing racism. And throughout all, holding up and honoring the knowledge and artistic work of our Black, Indigenous, and other minoritized scholars, teachers, and artists. We do this situated as we are, as I am right now, in a campus built through wealth extracted by slavocrats from the labor of enslaved Black women, men, and children. And we do this too on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, to whom and for whom I offer this land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respect to the Piscataway elders and ancestors. And we ask that everyone here take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement, all of these legacies that bring us here today. We've worked with our colleagues in the Phillips Department of Diversity, Equity, Access, and Inclusion, particularly, and I'm very grateful, particularly with Yolanda Hester, the program manager, and Gary Colgano, Sherman Fairchild Fellow, and a current graduate student at George Washington University. And I want to say a special thank you to Gary because his research yielded this program. And together we've developed this event to bring scholars and curators whose work challenges us and inspires us to sustained anti-racist study and practice. I want to thank you very much for joining us. And I want to welcome our moderator today, Sika Bonsu. Sika.
Hello, 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 and welcome to tonight's program, Haunted, the Black Body as Ancestor and Spectre, hosted by the Phillips Collection and the University of Maryland. I'm Sika Bonsu, and I'm honored to be your moderator for tonight. I'm also so delighted to introduce our two panelists for tonight's discussion. Bridget R. Cooks is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research focuses on African American artists, Black visual culture, as well as museum criticism. Cooks has also worked in museum education and has curated several exhibitions, including nationally touring exhibition, The Black Index, which is currently on view at the art galleries at the Black Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She is also the author of the book Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans in the American Art Museum, and her newest co-edited publication, Mannequins in Museums, Power and Resistance on Display. Bridget is joined by Robert Cozzolino, who is the Patrick and Amy Butler Curator of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. He has curated over 60 exhibitions, including the current touring exhibition, Supernatural America, the Paranormal in American Art, currently on view at the Speed Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. Originally trained as a musician, he has also played free improvised music as a percussionist since 1993. We also invite the audience to post comments and questions for a Q&A session following the discussion. Please join me in welcoming Bridget and Robert.
Thank you, Sika and Tita and Yolanda and Gary and everybody at the Phillips and the University of Maryland for having my friend Bridget and me here. Hi, Bridget.
Hi everybody.
So before we start, I wanted to just also say that I'm speaking to you from what we now call Minneapolis, and it's on Dakota land. And it's also the ancestral home of the Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, and Dakota together. And I'm honored to call those different communities and members from those communities my neighbors, my friends, and my co-collaborators. And I'm also really pleased to be here tonight with Bridget to talk about lots of different things. But one of the things that we share in common is our interest in haunting, not just as a metaphor, but as something that we experience. And I thought we would just begin by talking about what we mean by haunting history, haunting space. And I think Bridget and I could both give examples from our practice and our lives, but I thought we might ground this conversation that way. So Bridget, what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for the introduction and for accepting the invitation to be an interlocutor. I also want to say that I'm located on the traditional lands of the Tongva Nations here in Southern California. And, even just doing a land acknowledgement connects to hauntings, right? That part of what we're doing with the land acknowledgements and hopefully with the land beyond the acknowledgements is about bringing a kind of awareness at this point, but hopefully more than that in terms of how we live with the past in our daily lives, So I think that's very much connected to the premise of what we're going to talk about here, and haunting, yes, as metaphor, but haunting also in really practical lived experience ways, like you said. And I'm going to think about particularly my research with the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum, which I know many people have gone to or heard of, and think about haunting, my experiences of haunting, and what the project is there and how it brings to bear a kind of ancestral communication embodied through these wax figures that are these, real kind of phantasms, in this space. We think about, particularly with African American history, which was something very important for the founders of the museum, Joanne and Elmer Morgan, that was really important for them to embody and make part of a kind of supplement for the Baltimore school district, right? How do we bring in Black history? How do we give a sense of particularly Black pride to school-age kids in the 80s and 90s? So we're looking at where the museum is presently. It's in a retired firehouse in a economically deficit, drug-ravaged community, where there are still people who live there. There are families that live there, and they are serviced by the story of the Great Blacks in Wax Museum and all the narratives that they tell. So just looking at this sort of flyer or flag on the side, right? Welcome to the Great Blacks in Wax Museum, taking you through the pages of time. And then you've got these, for one of their many icons, these two figures who have this giant book of history, right? And that you're going to walk through. So I wanted to show this map just so that you can see some of the thematic spaces that you walk through when you go to the museum. It's 3 different levels. So, right, we're looking at, I think we're looking at all of the levels in a sense, because at the top, you can see these arrows that go down and they indicate what's in those spaces. So you have a main level where you see faces that are familiar, like Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, Harriet Tubman, and then explorers from the past. Some names may be more familiar than others. Upstairs you have more local heroes, people who are notable in the African American communities in Baltimore. And then there's 2 basements. So one is dedicated to the history of lynching and connected to contemporary issues of drug abuse in Baltimore. And then in a separate basement is a recreation of the hull of a slave ship. So it's intense. It's very intentional in the way in which I think Joanne and Elmer Martin want people to respond, to have a visceral reaction. And they really wanted to use the wax figure because they felt like that it had this particular kind of way of bringing reality into view, right? In a way, let's see, another way to say that, if we're thinking about haunting and haunting histories, there's a way in which you can use the human form to bring that history to life, right? It's kind of a cliche, but when you go there and you see Frederick Douglass sitting there, right, it's like something unusual happens. It's not like looking at a photograph of him. It seems to be more of a potential for actual communication.
Yeah, in the essay that you wrote about this museum and your experience of going through it and what the intention behind it is, you have a quote from one of the founders that I really like, which is, Elmer says, community development and cultural development go hand in hand. Conventional wisdom all over this nation is that you hide your poverty areas. Once you succeed in hiding them, you can succeed in neglecting them. And I also feel like that is true of history, right? So if you deny and you hide what has happened, you can neglect it. But I think in the terms of haunting, it is going to resurface, and it's going to resurface in a way where you have to confront it. And in a way, it seems like this museum gives that process of making sure that these things are not forgotten, and that you take what you see in them out into the world and are changed by it.
Yeah, it's a really great quotation from Elmer, and I think it helps us have some insight into the kind of visibility that he and Joanne were really trying to make apparent, so that perhaps by bringing a kind of human form of W.E.B. Du Bois or Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth, there's a presence that is reanimated that cannot be denied as easily, and certainly I think for myself and probably for many others, you have that feeling that something extra is happening when you're in their presence, right? I mean, they're not real people, and yet there is a feeling of the space being haunted. And also, I think if you're interested in history and you're thinking about Black futures, you feel a kind of a burden of accountability and a burden to fulfill a promise by ancestors. And that is really something you feel very presently when you're in that space.
Yeah, we talked about how some of the mechanisms and the practical, mundane aspects of simply occupying a building with this material that are not concealed in the way that you expect museum stagecraft to conceal them. I guess the image on the left shows that. And there's some other examples of that where it coexists with that. Whether it's intentional or not, it feels like it's like these are apparitions that have come into 2021 to remind you and to, see if you're up to the challenge of making sure that you are fulfilling an anti-racist kind of premise of your life, if that's what you're trying to live. And it's that weird juxtaposition of not concealing, not trying to give a sense that you're in another world, but that it's existing in your world and kind of in an uncanny way, being super emphatically present.
Yeah, this is such an important point. So
You want to
actually,
go on?
Bob, go back to that same slide we were looking at. Yeah,
okay.
this one, and then we can move forward. But just to clarify, exactly what Bob's talking about is the fact that in a way, as a visitor, you're supposed to ignore the atmosphere, right? It's like there is an object on display and I'm going to focus on the object. My experience is that I cannot ignore the trash can. I cannot ignore the fire alarm, right? That this is part of the present day environment, the retired firehouse, the space that we're in. And part of this, I argue, is distracting. And in another way that I think is more generative, we can think about taking into account a kind of one thing, economic situation. I mean, we talked about, I mentioned the neighborhood being an impoverished neighborhood. The museum being less concerned about the bells and whistles and, hiding the wizard behind the curtain, and more interested in a kind of earnest presentation of history. And I think part of what we think about when we talk about haunting, and I'm thinking about the theorist David Marriott, who has his book Haunted Life, in which he talks about racial slavery being a main haunter of media and new technologies. And so I think about the promises, the hopes that these great Black figures in wax had for us now, and then a kind of economic reality of how far we've come from the legacies of racial slavery, the great chasms in terms of classes and races in the United States, the connection between race and class, and how that is part of the presentation of this history that we're haunted by. It's not something that you can hide or make look more presentable. It's part of that narrative of uplift.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that example. And if you go forward, Bob.
Which one?
Yeah, I know. There's a story for each one. So let's stay here. Go forward one more.
This one?
Yeah. So this is another example. This is on the left, one of the spaces in the hull of the slave ship recreation when you go downstairs. And so this is, as you can see, there's just a piece of paper there that says branding. And there's no more didactic information. It's really a museum that is helpful to experience with a guide who can bring that oral tradition into the experience of walking through. And they have that, and that's available, and you can set that up. But if you go on your own, you have to sort of make sense of the scenes as best you can. And so you're seeing this violence. You're seeing these mannequins who are being repurposed, but you also see the exit sign. You also see the artificial grass, and I feel like that brings across a kind of, presence of the violence of the past into our current day situation, right? So that the past becomes visible, and it's also a part of the way that we experience our everyday. And what Great Blacks in Wax does is put it right there in front of you so that those two time periods are together as one, and then we have to make sense of it.
Yeah, right. Do you want to talk about any of the other images that you've?
I'll just tell you what they are since they're all here. So so Marcus Garvey, this is just an example of some of the kind of iconic niches that are made, these little areas that are made for displays of particularly famous people. So the father of Black nationalism, a quote from Marcus Garvey. Sometimes you can't tell who the person is. You really have to depend on the cues and the labels to figure it out. And that's something that, the Martins were aware of. And I think one thing you see when you're looking at the different mannequins, wax figures, and sculptures of people is that they get more realistic with time. But in some cases, the realism or the naturalism is less important than the reminder of who that person was.
Mm-hmm.
This is just another image of sort of the main part of the slave ship enclosure downstairs. So you can see these are repurposed mannequins. And then there are photographs and reproductions of prints, and then a lot of text that you can see on that plexiglass. And there is on the left at the bottom in that corner, there's a body that's been burned. There's also somewhere on this wall a slave quarter that's empty, and you as the visitor can imagine or asked to imagine that you would be in that space. Yeah, there it is, guest quarters. Yeah, on the right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bob, please talk to us about how you've been thinking about haunting and dealing with specters in your own curatorial practice.
Well, I think, there's a great responsibility of museum curators, no matter what your background is, to really not only first and foremost to acknowledge the place from which you are curating, the immediate local and regional area, and to know that history and to talk to the communities that are here. And I think that is how you go forward with your work, no matter what kind of topic you're going to be dealing with. And it doesn't matter to me at an institution like the Minneapolis Institute, whether you're curating Korean art from 3,000 years ago, Japanese art, or art of the United States. I think you really need to know your community, and they need to know you and get to understand who you are and what you're about. And that's how you learn and grow. And so necessarily, when I came here in 2016, within a few weeks, I had met a lot of Indigenous artists, and it completely shifted the focus for me. I'm not going to specialize in Indigenous art, but I know a lot of Indigenous contemporary artists now who are active here and elsewhere. And I came from Philadelphia, where that wasn't really a focus and it wasn't really prominent and present. And it may have changed, but this is the birthplace of the American Indian movement from the late 60s, and it's still present here. And the history and the violent history and the unjust history of what's happened on Indigenous land, particularly in Minnesota, is critical to understanding being here. And so that shift in focus really made me kind of think about, what does that mean as a curator? How does that history inform what I do? And how is it in the present? There have been plenty of examples since I've arrived here where it is resurfaced in the present because people are not acknowledging the past. And so, Bridget, you and I have talked about this a lot with the Supernatural project, which we'll get to, but in other projects that I've done on a small scale, but still required a lot of listening and talking and collaboration and going to communities that I've never really worked with humility, like the Cultural Wellness Center, which is a African-based knowledge system community wellness center in the Twin Cities. We did this project together with our curator of African art, which brought contemporary artists and some historical African art. This is a Joe Minter piece and Renee Stout, but we really had them lead with the didactics, with the framework, in the collaboration. And these are just a few images from that. And it was a way of honoring ancestors, but also showing how in contemporary African art, whether it's works by Richard Burnside or Leonardo Benzant, there's an acknowledgement of the past in their work that is built into the work, and that is about that relationship between the past and the present. So the installation gave space around that material and also made, centered the Black voices. And I think that kind of a collaboration is really important at large institutions and small, because I think curators are often afraid of the possibility of giving up power. But in my experience, really, your practice only deepens when you are in relation with folks and really learn from what they are going to bring about, what they know about all of these things, including obviously their own culture. So that was one example, and that's just how I've tried to operate here and how I will always operate, and probably learn and incorporate other things. But, in terms of haunting, Bridget, about Jack Whitten's ghost paintings that he made in 1963, 64. These are a couple of examples. And these are paintings that, were critical to thinking about how haunting is embedded in people's work, but is a good example of how gatekeepers, in particular his gallery, were uncomfortable with me including the work in the show, and forbade them from being in the show, at least the ones that I wanted to borrow. So a private collector actually lent them. But it was this idea that things that Whitten had actually said multiple times in his notebooks and to interviewers in his lifetime were being suppressed. And it was about this kind of volatile sort of childhood memories that were related to lynching, stories that he had heard from his father were in his work at a pivotal time in the civil rights era, were kind of being suppressed, that I just felt like there's no way you can really do that. They have to be present. So they're present in the book, but there's some other pictures from the series in the show. What did you think about that, Bridget, when we talked about how they're being sidelined or suppressed?
I think that, we didn't get, or you didn't get a direct, clear answer about why the work was being excluded. So, just to speculate, we do think about how overdue your exhibition was, in terms of dealing with issues of the paranormal and spirituality in various forms. So it seems like it's something that's still not taken seriously, and perhaps people are concerned that it might damage the reputation of the work if the artist is known to have been a believer. And, we don't know exactly why, but it seems like it's an opportunity for particularly Black artists to have their work seen in different arenas, which I know many of the artists that you've worked with in putting the show together were really interested in having their work looked at thematically outside of a kind of racial collective. To present the work, and maybe in that way some other dimensions of the art will be paid attention to.
Right. We have talked about how some of the artists who are included in the show who are African American have expressed how often, most of the time, they're put into shows about Black art as if that's the only way, or it's not. It's the only way to look through a lens of identity in their work, when they have multiple kinds of identity and layers that are related to that. And so I think, we talk about this with women artists all the time, that what does there have to be another women artist show? Can't we just start thinking about these things differently, instead of putting people in boxes like that? And with regard to this, I think that idea that the work is about this and that, and there's a power in them being related rather than being separated out, seem to come up again and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's something that's great about your show and the scholarship around it in the book is that it is bringing together commonalities between people without saying everyone is the same. You know, it's like there are different kinds of hauntings, there are different kinds of histories, there's different levels of guilt. There's you
Mhm.
know, histories of colonization that we're not all equally implicated by.
Mhm.
And to be able to bring those textures to bear on the perception of the work, I think is really important. You know, with Whitfield Lovell's work in particular, I feel like every object he has, because he works with used material, has its own spiritual history, right? It has its own history of function with people. And so
Mhm.
when he brings all of that together in these spaces where he often likes to have food, you know, he wants you to smell the collard greens and the chicken and the yam, you know, he
Yeah.
wants you to really have that multi-sensory experience. Um, it is going to feel different. There are lives whose remnants are part of these objects.
Mhm.
And I don't think that museums are very good at embracing that possibility. And I think it goes back to what you're saying about losing control, right? Wanting to be the authority on everything,
Right.
and not letting voices speak when they need to be heard.
And also, you know, for me, one of the things that's always been important is whether you're going to the archive and seeing what artists actually said, or you have the privilege of talking to living artists, is that we need to take their experiences seriously and really listen to them and understand that that's one thing that the work is about, and that we really have to honor that when we show it and when we do the framework around it and the interpretation. And so, you know, before you even put somebody's work in a show like this, it's critical to reach out to them and say, this is what I'm working on. You know, I felt your work was about some of these issues, but I wanted to make sure first that it is, and hear what they have to say. And in the case of Whitfield, he had said that, you know, that's exactly in line with a lot of what he thinks about and what motivates his work, but he hadn't really been asked about that in that particular way before. So Whitfield was a beautiful example of being really open and generous about that relationship to haunting in his work. And it wasn't like it, you know, somehow verified what I was thinking or what I felt in my gut when I saw it. It was more like it deepened and expanded suddenly the different ways one would experience something like this piece from 2001, The Parlor Room, from his Richmond project. And he was, again, you know him better than I do, but he was so excited that this was a context that it was going to be seen in, because it opens up new opportunities for talking about his work in different ways.
Mhm. You know, I wanted to read, this is related to what we're talking about, but I had thought earlier about one of my colleagues, great critical theorist, Frank Welderson. And there's an essay he wrote called Grammar and Ghosts, The
Mhm.
Performative Limits of African Freedom, from 2009. And there's a quotation that I really like, it's very short. He was talking about being at a particular conference of academics and artists, and he said that these kinds of gatherings of particularly Black people are always haunted by a shared sense that violence and captivity are the grammar and ghosts of our every gesture. This is where performance meets ontology. So thinking here, that's the end of the quote, thinking here about where performance, um, and with Whitfield's work, the performance of the visitor walking through, right?
Mhm.
And feeling these ghosts, feeling the spirit of many people, and feeling ritual, right, in those spaces. That's something that can really motivate viewers to engage. But I think that at worst, museums are afraid to let that kind of breathing and communication really happen, because
Mhm.
uh, because museums should be haunted, right? Because of the collections that they have. Once they open up that portal, right, who knows who's coming in? Who knows what's going to happen to the authority of the museum? Who knows what's going to happen to their permanent collection in terms of repatriation? Who knows who's going to be protesting outside? Who knows what's going to be on social media? So there's this operation on the basis of fear of haunting, I think, that is part of the antagonism that the public has with museums and artists have with museums right now.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and you sort of touch on this issue of, there's certain objects that for the makers or for the cultures from which they come that are alive. They're not things that sit places, that they are full of a spirit. And there's this idea that you might ask them, do they want to be there, or how do they want to be seen? And that certainly was the experience for me when we did Enduring Soul, because the folks from the Cultural Wellness Center talked about that in particular with the gungun dress, the ceremonial dress, that it had to look alive and being active. If the compromise was that it was in the museum to begin with, it couldn't just be put in a case. It had to look like it was being animated, and we worked with them to make sure that it was put in that way, and it had space around it, and it was given a way to breathe. And so that's the kind of time and effort that has to go into those kinds of conversations and ways of approaching curatorial practice. You can't do it. You can't do it otherwise. And I think to approach it in a way where these things are things, they're objects rather than expressions of the spirit, it is missing the point a lot of times. And I would say Whitfield would probably say the same thing about this. One of the things we're missing, not only did you mention the sense, here's tobacco in this one, and some other things that he makes part of the oral experience, but there's also an actor who is reading the names of this historically Black ward in Richmond, Virginia, of people who lived in this particular neighborhood or on this block, that you hear when you walk in. So you're getting, your senses are all being activated. You're not only looking at things, but moving through the space, but also you're smelling the wood and the other components of this. So the piece is alive.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, I wanted you to say more about Supernatural, though. I mean, I don't know if you want to, but I mean, this is one really excellent example of what you can see in the exhibition and the kind of themes that are brought out in the show. But there's, I mean, if you would maybe talk about another form of haunting, so people just get a more expansive view of all the different things that are, because how many works are in the show approximately, Bob?
I think 170. There might be more.
So this is one.
Yeah.
But if there's anything else, just so people.
Well, the exhibition, which is currently, as Sika mentioned, is at the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, and will come to Minneapolis in February, and we'll do a lot of on-site programming with the artists and other folks. And it'll be on view till May of 2022. It's about contact. It's about the will to make contact with the otherworldly and the spirit world. And it looks at how that's manifested itself in the visual arts in people active in what we now call the United States. So it goes from the 1780s is the earliest object. It's a small locket. It's 1.5 inches high that shows a woman coming to her daughter's grave and the daughter breaking out of the grave to make contact with the living. And so the show is about different degrees to which that is expressed in artwork. And most of the work in the exhibition, I would say at least 85% or more, is by artists who we know had those experiences of spirit contact, or what we would call the paranormal, although they would say it's normal. Contact with spirits or interdimensional beings, or other kinds of uncanny experiences that were unexplained. And so they're by people who aren't just making it up, or in the case of the UFO section, it's not science fiction material. It is work by artists who were witnesses or experiencers. And a great deal of the work, is about history, like this piece by Whitfield, although he means it with regard to spirits. But there's also a piece by John Hotelanos, who he did a video that was commissioned by the Denver Art Museum that was animating the famous image of Manifest Destiny called Progress by John Gast, a painting from 1872 that was very popular. And it shows an allegorical figure of progress moving westward and sort of eradicating indigenous people and wildlife and changing the land. And he animated it from an indigenous point of view, and it's very powerful. And that piece is really a touchstone for some of the broader issues, but it also includes mediums who are active at spiritualist camps who did not make art for the art world, but were making art in a sacred communal space in trance states where they said that they're not responsible for the art. The spirit is actually animating and controlling their pens or pencils or paintbrushes. And there are other folks besides spiritualists, including John Bunyan Murray or Minnie Evans, who are included in that section as well, because that was one of the ways they talked about how their art was made and how to understand it. So those are some of the things. Is that what you want me to talk about, Bridget?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, because
Yeah.
it's a major exhibition, and within it, Whitfield's parlor is a special treat. But there are many themes, and there are Black artists throughout the exhibition that are engaging with the themes of the exhibition in different ways. So,
well, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I think you really should talk about the Black Index if you can.
okay.
It's an amazing show and project and a beautiful catalog.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'll just briefly, this is an exhibition I curated that's touring of 6 different artists. Titus Kaphar, Whitfield, Lovell, who we're talking about, Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, Alicia Henry, and Lava Thomas. I think that's all 6 of them. And this is just an installation photograph. The show is up in Austin, as Sika said, and then it's going to open in New York at Hunter College in January. So the premise of the show has to do with some of the struggles that I was having and continue to have with the normality of Black death, and sort of how you go about your day, going to work, teaching your students, doing your writing, cooking dinner, while you are bombarded with images of anti-Black violence. And I wanted to have an exhibition in which there were artists who were really exploring some of that constant communication with the dead, and the way that we're haunted by media, right, by the violence that we see recorded, but also just the stories that show that we're not really making much progress, or no substantial structural progress in terms of eradicating anti-Blackness in America. So this is work by Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, who was inspired by the fact that there are tens of thousands of Black American women who are disappeared every year, and how little we know about them and how little effort they get in response to their disappearances. And she decided to make a series of images after channeling their spirits and creating these really inquisitive, impossible women who are often doing things we can't tell exactly what they're doing. There's a lot of movement, there's a lot of life in them. She made 100 ink drawings of these women to help us think about the loss and what they might be doing in another dimension, the Evanescent, the Untouchables. And if you go to the blackindex.art, you can see all of them. She also made a breathing meditation where there's a timed presentation of all of 100 drawings. Alicia Henry made this incredible artwork that has about 150 faces made out of leather and suede. And this is an array of them in this fashion, this shape that she created. And so we think about the title of the work, Analogous 3, this is her third version of it, but how these faces are analogous to ghosts or to spirits or to protesters or ancestors. I think there might be a detail or two. She really works and reworks the fabric and kind of traumatizes the materials to bring out these faces and a sense of their history. So these are just a couple of examples, and I won't go through all of the work of the 6 artists, but I do invite you to go to the website. We have short films with, we have an opera singer singing in the gallery. We have a dancer in the gallery, all taking this idea of the Black Index and ideas of death and haunting and persistence, and creating some new performative works in response.
Great. Yeah,
That's
this
that in a nutshell.
Powerful installation. Yeah, I
Thank
think.
you.
And so where else is this at its last stop, Bridget, or where else can folks see it?
Yeah, the next stop at the Leubsdorff Gallery at Hunter College in New York is the last stop.
Okay.
Yeah. And there is a catalog. Let me pitch that like a good curator. There is a catalog here. This is work of Dennis Delgado on the front, who makes these ghost-like images, which are kind of a composite face from 6 different works of, actually 4 different works of Black cinema. So like Do the Right Thing. He uses facial recognition software to scan all the faces, and then he makes this sort of composite specter at the end. And his work you can see in this image on the screen on the left, presented on iPads.
Excellent.
Thanks, Tita. Order your copy here in the chat. I'm not making any money off of the book, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a catalog for Supernatural America, and Bridget also wrote an essay in it, and
Bob did too.
Yeah.
You wrote 2.
I did.
Yeah. So yeah, but any questions or Sika, any thoughts you want to help us sort out?
I was just too wrapped up in this conversation. This is amazing. I personally have a question for you, Bridget and Bob. I know Bridget talked about this earlier, but I was curious on how when you all were putting together these exhibitions, like what were your perceptions of like time and progress as you were putting together these exhibitions?
Do you mean progress as a civilization?
Yeah, like progress.
In society, because damn, 2020. But or do you mean just how does one go about doing these kinds of projects? Because that's complicated too.
I was talking about progress in terms of maybe social progress, Black progress. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Go first. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm in Minneapolis, and you know, I think I recently had an experience where I was presenting to a group of folks, and there were some questions about, some assumptions about where I am, and how the city's in ruins, and we've defunded the police, and all sorts of other things. And I think it's hard unless you're here to understand that while we're not unique, what happened in 2020 didn't spark this uprising just out of nowhere. It was building. This particular community has had a lot of loss in terms of Black death and other kinds of things like that. You know, going back to Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, the first year that I was here, and people had had enough. You know, you'd think that every time there's something that happens, it's enough. And so I think the nation seemed to see Minneapolis just kind of erupt. But there is a caring activist community here who really wants the place to be one of justice and wants it to be equitable. And it's a constant fight. And so I think for cultural workers at different museums and other places in the community, from 2016, when I started here with a lot of other new curators who came from other places, one of the things we were asking ourselves, in part because of the election too, in that year, is how can our curatorial practice reflect the kind of moral, the moral sort of conscious that we want to project, and the kinds of people that we want to be, and how do we take what the community is asking for and sometimes demanding and make that an integral part of who we are as a place. And I think that's still an ongoing conversation. And I think it's sometimes really hard at institutions. But, you know, the curators really have to listen to the community and think about how what you collect and what you show reflects your values. And so that's always something that's in my mind. And as I mentioned at the top, you know, the thinking about indigeneity and where we are and the whole histories that have happened in this region because of that, because of colonialism, is also really critical to the context in which you curate here. And you ignore it to your detriment, and it doesn't do anybody any good. So when I was working on Supernatural America, while these things that happened in 2020, they happened while the show was in a critical part of organization. It didn't color it, but it just felt like so much of what artists were talking about already in the 20th century were just being reprised. And it just made what they had to say feel much more present and important. And, you know, I talked to a lot of advisors during the process, not just in 2020, but, you know, just kind of checking in and making sure, and Bridget was certainly one of those folks, is the framework right? Is this reflecting what we need to say right now? And I'll let viewers and readers be the judge of that. But, you know, you just kind of put it out there and you hope that at least what you believe is kind of coming through.
Yeah. And yeah.
Bridget,
So
do you want to say something?
You know, I just briefly, I'll say that it was really helpful for me to be working on this show during the pandemic and all of the demonstrative, you know, response to anti-Black violence. You know, sometimes when you're watching things on TV or even witnessing things or experiencing them in your real life that are about anti-Blackness, you know, you can feel very vulnerable, but also really alone. And you know you're not alone, but you still feel like you are, right? Because it's that kind of vulnerability that kicks in. And so it was great to be able to work with closely and become friends with artists who were also trying to make sense of the moment. You know, no one makes sense of it, but survive it and try to think through it. And it's something that you can't stop thinking about, and yet you still have to go about your day, keep your job and things like that. Yeah. So it was helpful to be able to talk to people that I knew were also struggling and doing something really generative. And I feel like for many people, walking through the Black Index is an experience of validation, you know, and not feeling so isolated, which is something we've been suffering from. So I can say that my time putting the show together was spent in that communion with people. I also think in terms of the subject matter and all of the dimensions that are in the work, all of the artists are working with time in some way. And again, like going back to Great Blacks and Wax, bringing the past into the present, thinking about the future, and also thinking about different realities that we don't know enough about, to try to, almost in an Afrofuturist way, or not, you know, necessarily to brand it in that way, but thinking about other possibilities for life. And I think about Calvin Warren and his definition of Black time, right? It's a time that's not chronological, it's asynchronous, it is. It's another kind of metaphysical way of thinking through Blackness, and a kind of persistence, regardless of what the calendar says and how the years go by. So all of those things I think are brought to bear in my experience of time and the exhibition.
Yeah, thank you. Franz just put into the chat a question. Is there any cure to racism in America and the types of violence we've been experiencing from the beginning?
Boy.
I kind of like the idea of a cure. I mean, because that's a nice science fiction, you know, kind of thing that I like to fantasize about that. But I like the idea of a cure because it does help us think about racism as a disease. It's a disease. It's a construction. You know, it's something that has very real consequences. So I don't think, no, that there's any instant cure. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done on all fronts. There's, racism is a disease, colonialism is a disease, but not everybody wants to be cured. I mean, people are totally happy to be ill.
One of the things that Resmaa Menakem says and talks about is how white people have kind of lost a sense of culture and need to move from race to culture and regain that. And also that a lot of white people don't know any Black people. You know, they're not interacting with them. They're not mixing with them. They're not going to their churches or events or being, you know, that kind of relation is part of what continues to make people probably have fear, irrational fear, and all those kinds of things that contribute with other things to racism. And, you know, there's a lot in that. But I don't know. I mean, it's definitely, like you say, I mean, it's a public health issue.
They just said, is it from a sense of guilt?
No, I don't know what, I mean, probably for some people it is. I don't think it is for everyone, but I don't know. I tell my students I didn't invent racism. Black people didn't invent race or racism, and we're not responsible for getting rid of it.
Yeah.
I think that might be a really good place. A period.
Okay.
Right? I think yeah. Right. Yeah. So thank you so much. We're at the top of the hour, and I just want to thank everyone who's been a part of this. I really want to thank Bridget and Bob and Sika for bringing your creativity and ethics and community and sense of obligation to who we defining who we are in a way that is reparative. And everyone, I just put in the chat 2 fabulous books for you to buy.
Oh,
Get all of your shopping done now. But I want to thank everyone. And one of the quirks of a webinar is that I hit end meeting and we all go off. But I want to thank everyone who was here. And yes, and more. Yes, and more. So any last words? I give it to Sika, Bridget, and Bob. Any last words you want to share?
just thank you for the opportunity, and it's so great to meet you and put the faces to the emails, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak and yeah, to be stimulated really by all the things that people have to contribute. So
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you, Bridget.
yeah, I appreciate you too.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm ending it. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.